Welcome to EPG Pathshala. Dear students, today we would be discussing the evolution or the history of human settlements um, after Christ era, part 5. Now, this explains a timeline, or this pertains to a timeline where there was this Renaissance period and also ancient American civilizations. So this part would take care of these two um, time periods and their civilizations. So the Renaissance period started with or started in Florence, which was in Italy, and it spread from Florence to the rest of the Italy and to other parts of Europe and in Russia. So the countries like England, France, Germany, Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, Hungary, Poland. So it spread in these countries apart from Russia. Now this was an era, Renaissance means revival, and so this was an era which was marked by secularism, rationality, individualism. You know, the church was losing its, it was a sort of a, church was losing its grip, or religion was losing its losing its very significant importance. And then there was other, as we say, that secularism and rationality and individualism was coming up. So there was printing press which helped disseminate ideas on science and arts, earth and universe, human anatomy, etc. Then trade flourished in many Italian cities as centers, and they became centers of banking, commerce and industry. Now, in the early 1400s, there was a treaty with the Ottoman Empire, and trade concessions were got or were received, and therefore ships were supplied, and Ottoman Empire was assisted in trade with the East. Now Venice became a port and a commercial power in this period of time, and the Renaissance art marks a cultural rebirth at the close of the Middle Ages and rise of the modern world. So new forms of technique, new art forms and printing developed, like human anatomy. You can see in this figure the blend of art and science by Leonardo da Vinci, and there's a study of light and shadow, and Leonardo da Vinci was a figure or most well-known personality of in this discipline or in this specialization, and the outstanding architectural work was rebuilding of the St. Peter's Basilica, and the Renaissance architects found a harmony between human proportions and buildings, and the use of the golden triangle became prevalent, and or golden triangle was used in this time. Then the settlements were characterized, you know, by or they represented an expression of glory, and therefore they were monumental in nature, monumental vistas, lavish palaces. There was emphasis on development of congregation spaces, geometric form. There were piazzas, plazas in and around religious buildings with sculptures and fountains, and there were wide avenues, and there were defense walls. You can see the Vatican City Plaza, the figure of the Vatican City Plaza, and how the scale, the monumental scale of the plaza. So next we come, and then we find that there were also gardens, royal gardens. You can see the French Renaissance garden, the figure shows that. Then there were radial roads which extended outwards. There was an air of grandeur, it was so glory and grandeur. So that was a characteristic of planning and architecture in this area, in this time. So it was marked by unparalleled proportions. There was emphasis on symmetry, on geometry and regularity. And then towns were centered around dominating buildings of the nobles, the kings, and the religion subservient. As I said earlier, there was this decline of the church and there was this rise of the middle class. So political power belonged to the possessors of urban wealth, that is the landowners. It was wealth related to land, which pertained to the land, to pertain to possession of the land. So therefore landowners, that is bankers, and then merchants, businessmen. But there were political and territorial conflicts between the feudal lords and the emerging middle class. So, and the major settlements of this period, as I said, Venice was one of them, then Florence and Milan was. So now when we look at Venice, when we try to understand, taking a case of one of the major settlements, that is understanding Venice, we find that you can see the location of Venice, and it was the topography that was characterized by islands and lagoons, and the population was about 1.5 lakhs people were there, and there were excellent structural designers, and you can see advanced maritime technology. You can see the Rialto Bridge, and then there was no agriculture, no land for agriculture, but trade and commerce flourished. There were craftsmen, fishermen, salt traders, and it promoted in migration. It emerged as a center of the arts in Europe, and it also had a navy. As we said, it was a naval sea, it was a port, so it had a navy of some about more than 3,000 ships by 1410. And if we look at the settlement pattern of or the town characteristics of Venice, you can see in this photograph or in this picture that how the town looked like. It was based on water, basically water-based transport was the most significant part of the settlement, and after its release from Byzantine Empire, Venice installed its own noblemen to govern the area. And Venice, you can see the second photograph which shows the plan of Venice as rendered by Ottoman admiral and cartographers in the early 16th century. From the Renaissance period, we now move on to the ancient American civilizations. Though it is not in the same time period or not in the same timeline, but we find that ancient American civilization actually had started much earlier in 2000 BCE, and it continued till the 16th century. Now we come to the Mesoamerican civilization, that is the Mayan and the Aztec civilization. You can see the drawing, the spread of the Mayan and the Aztec civilization, and the Mayans came first, which is from 2000 BC to 1600 ACE. So it had a large time, it spanned a larger time frame. And then the Aztecs came, you can see the location of the Aztec Empire from 1250 ACE to 1422 ACE. And now we start with the Mayan civilization, which is one of the Mesoamerican civilization, which had a larger time span, and it was the social structure of this Mayan civilization was that there was a ruling chief, there were nobles, there were merchants, there were artisans, there were farmers. and they were highly religious, worshipped gods related to nature, uh, pottery, painting, murals, ceramics. They delved into that. Then there were manpower intensive practices for agricultural intensive. They had an agricultural intensive economy, and which was a lot of people employed, labor based. Then advanced farming methods were there, like irrigation, step farming. There was study of mathematics, geometry, astrology, alchemy. In terms of settlement planning, we find that it was organic growth which was based on the topography. It was minimal planning. The focus was on large open public spaces surrounded by important political and religious buildings. And then we come next to the regarding the governance mechanism of the Mayan civilization. We find that there were city-states, there were independent city-states, and but there was also a tribal king. There were taxes were levied by city-states, and regarding the, as I said earlier, they used a lot of variety of materials such as stone, wood, ceramics, jade, and bones to decorate their buildings. There were stone sculptures and carvings. There were mural paintings on the walls, pottery. Then weaving and feather working was there. We go on to the Aztec civilization. Now, Aztec civilization, as I said earlier, its time span was much less than the Mayan civilization. It was in the Aztec region. Its location was the Aztec region of North America, and it had an agricultural economy, but they also had trading of goods. Society was divided into classes of nobles and commoners. There were government officials and priests, traders, craftsmen, farmers. Then there were slaves. Education, or different schools were there for different social class. And then they were regarding the art skills, whatever they had was fire, clay, statues of gods they built. Then they also used indigenous bark, paper, codices. The governance mechanism of the Aztec civilization was that there were, as we said earlier, that there were city-states in Mayan, but here also, in Aztecs also there were city-states, large conglomeration of city-states that may or may not, that may not have been connected or may have been connected. With whatever information we find, that we can say that there were large conglomeration of city-states. Then there was no single governance, only system of tribute. Then no political interference as long as tributes were received. Then there was a powerful and highly disciplined military force, people, or this Aztecs, were conquered by the Spaniards in 1520, around 1520, and the height of this Aztec civilization or the settlements were about 7,500 feet high, and there were dams and other methods of irrigation. There were floating gardens, soils on woven rafts, and then orthogonal layout with roads for foot travel only. No wheeled vehicles, and then therefore transportation was difficult, and then astronomical orientations of buildings with unplanned residential zones were there. We come to one of the most important settlements of this time period, the Aztec civilization, that is Tenochtitlan, which is modern day Mexico. And as you can see in this drawing, or this figure, rather plan, shows the layout of Tenochtitlan. And as you can see, it is orthogonal planning. There were this standardized commoner housing, more than 2,000 apartment compounds, all aligned to the orthogonal grid. There were temples which were dedicated to the sun and the moon, and the scale was grand, it was massive scale. And the layout also had, in fact, the layout was dominated by a central avenue called the Street of the Dead, and which was considered as a functional analog of the Mesoamerican Central Public Plaza. The Central Public Plaza was small as compared to the other civilizations. This brings us to the next civilization, which we are discussing now, is the Incas, the Incan civilization, which is, you can see the location of the Incan civilization there. Now it was in South America, it was in Peru. Now people lived in the socioeconomic characteristics of this civilization was that people, the city was, or the society was divided into two classes. There was an upper class, the kings, priests, nobles, government officials. There was a lower class, that is the farmers, peasants, artisans. Then there was farming, there was animal domestication, there was mining and goods trading, that is trading of goods such as clothing and pottery. There were no merchants or markets. Government officials distributed goods. Religion was important. There were no human sacrifices like in Mayans and Aztecs. Only, in fact, it was more ritualistic. So religion was more ritualistic with animal sacrifices as compared, or it was different from the Mayans and the Aztecs, which had also human sacrifices. Now the governance, if you see the governance mechanism, it was a single state which was dominated by a tribal ruler and some nobles, and instead of paying taxes, people had to pay their government by labor, and which was called as, this system was called as mita, and this could include either through military service or through public works. And if we see the art and the skills, we find that gold sculpture of gods were there, elaborate costumes in rich cotton textiles were there. They made vases, plates, metal jewelry, and they had the musical instruments. Also they made wind instruments, percussion. And we go down to the settlement planning of the Incas. We find that, as we have discussed earlier, that the Aztecs were at a height of about 7,500, but we see for the Incas, they were at a height of about 15,000 feet above mean sea level. And therefore, the settlement planning was such that they planned with the topography. Their settlements were sort of blended in that with the natural land form, and the roads displayed great engineering and architectural skills, and then there were thousands of miles of stone paved roads, bridges, and so which connected the highland and the lowland dwellers, and there was no wheel traffic. They skilled in masonry. Now Incan civilization was located in Peru. It spread around 2,400 miles along the length of the western coast of the South America, in the Andes, and about 500 miles wide. It was about 500 miles wide, and the population was about 12 million, and it had a rugged mountainous topography, and therefore, as you can see, the settlement planning which we were discussing earlier, settlement planning was dependent, or was was dominated by the landform, and then the empire was divided into 4 regions or quarters, with Cuzco, the capital, at the center. Then they were radiating from the central plaza. There were 4 main roads which led to the 4 corners of the empire. And we come to now Cuzco, which was the one of the important, or the capital city. We find that, as I said earlier, that city planning was dominated by nature. It was integrated with nature. Same thing happened with Cuzco, like the other settlements of this civilization. The best lands were reserved for farming activity without wasting them for temples or villages. Then narrow streets took maximum advantage of the land. And then there were principles of partition, symmetry, opposition, repetition, and subordination. Town was divided into 2 parts: the upper part, the Hanan, and the lower part, the Urin. There were 4 sectors corresponding to the 4 nations of the empire, 12 neighborhoods resulting from division of the sector. The subdivision of these neighborhoods were in 3 parts: Kolana, Payan, and Kayao. And the urban core was occupied by, or the urban core was was dominated by the temples and palaces. So with this, we come to the end of the part 5 of the history and human settlements. So dear students, today we have learnt a time period, or we have learned a part of the history of settlements, or the evolution of settlements, which included Renaissance period, that is the decline of the Roman Empire, and the revival or the Italian Renaissance, which started in Florence, Italy. And we discussed about Renaissance, as well as we also discussed the Mesoamerican or rather the ancient American civilizations, which included the Mesoamerican civilizations, which had the Mayan and the Aztec civilization, and also the Incan civilization. But as I had earlier said, though this Mesoamerican civilization dated back to the before Christ era, we have discussed it here at this time period. We have brought it here in this point of time because it ended, or it ended at this point of time. So the next module will continue with the next phase of the time line, and we will see how the settlements have evolved. So thank you.